Remember that feeling riding bikes with friends, just until the streetlights came on? It's funny how like a simple memory can, totally take you back to that feeling, to that time when the world felt so full of possibility. Summer just stretched out like an endless adventure. Back in 1986, that's exactly how life felt for a lot of kids. Well, except in Tacoma, Washington. That's where that sense of carefree innocence was shattered for two families.
Yeah, such a stark contrast, right? You had the carefree days of youth and then the harsh reality of a community that's just gripped by fear.
Exactly. Jennifer Bastion and Michella Welch, two young girls, both blonde, small for their age, both around 12 or 13, and they both loved riding their bikes. And within just a few months of each other, they were both murdered. And their cases, they seemed linked. So today, we're diving into their stories. We're going to be exploring how a community grappled with this fear and what it took to bring justice, after decades of unanswered questions.
What really strikes me about these cases is the chilling similarities. I mean, not just between the victims, but also the circumstances of their disappearances. It's easy to see why the investigators initially believed they were searching for just one killer.
Right. Let's start with Michella. It was March, spring break. So imagine that excitement, of those first warm days, the promise of lazy afternoons spent playing outside. Michelle was at Puget Park with her two younger sisters.
And she was the responsible one. She was the oldest sister, the one in charge. It's a detail that adds another layer of heartbreak to this already tragic story.
It was a different era back then, wasn't it? No cell phones, no constant contact. They had a family call, a kind of yoo-hoo they'd use to find each other in the park. I mean, it's the kind of thing we all did back then.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So Michelle biked home to grab their forgotten lunch. And when her sisters returned to the playground, her bike was there, lunch on the table. But Michelle, gone.
And the family call went unanswered. And the babysitter was alerted. And then their mother, Barbara. And finally, the police. Hours later, her body was found. Blunt force trauma to the head, a cut to her neck, and evidence of sexual assault. I mean, a parent's worst nightmare come true.
It's unimaginable. And then just a few months later, in August, Jennifer vanished. She was training for a bike trip with a group from the YMCA. She was so determined to keep up with the group that she went to Point Defiance Park for a solo practice ride that day.
Point Defiance is huge, 760 acres with woods, cliffs, even a zoo and a beach. It would be, so easy to get lost in there.
And that's exactly what her parents feared. She left a note saying she'd be home by 6:30. And when she didn't show up, they knew. They knew instantly something was wrong. The search was massive. You had the police, volunteers, dogs combing through the park, but it was weeks before her body was found, also in a wooded area, and also with signs of sexual assault and strangulation.
Can you imagine the collective grief and the terror that just gripped Tacoma? The thought of, a potential serial killer on the loose, preying on young girls. I mean, it must have been absolutely paralyzing.
It changed everything. Kids weren't allowed to just, roam free anymore. Parents were, and understandably so, terrified. That sense of 80s childhood freedom, the kind we were just talking about, vanished almost overnight. And here's where it gets even more poignant. Remember Barbara Welch, Michella's mother? When she heard about Jennifer's disappearance, she went to the Bastion family home to offer support. I mean, having experienced that same unimaginable loss.
That just speaks volumes about the strength and the compassion of these mothers, reaching out to each other in the midst of such horrific circumstances. And it really underscores, the profound impact that these tragedies had on the entire community.
The police were convinced that they were looking for just one killer. I mean, it made sense at the time. Both girls were so similar. And the parks were relatively close, both in Tacoma's North End. Witnesses in both cases described seeing a man watching the girls, even one following Jennifer on a bike. They had composite sketches, those drawings police used to try and identify suspects.
Right. I mean, a crucial tool back then before, the widespread use of security cameras and digital imagery.
Exactly. They followed leads.
Yeah.
But nothing panned out. It was
Mhm.
the 80s. DNA technology wasn't what it is today, so the case went cold.
Mm-hmm.
But the memory of those girls, the fear, it lingered.
Yeah, but technology keeps moving forward, right? 2006, they were finally able to get a DNA profile from, evidence in Michella's case, but
Yep.
unfortunately there was no match in the system
Right.
in Jennifer's body. Too decomposed for similar samples, so the years just kept passing. And that initial assumption, one killer, two victims, it remained. But then...
But then, yeah, 2013,
Mhm.
a breakthrough. That swimsuit Jennifer was wearing. They sent it to the lab hoping to get, H or R DNA profile just in case,
Okay.
for the future. But what they got back,
A bombshell.
it was a bombshell.
Male DNA.
Yeah.
And get this. It didn't match the DNA from Michella's case at all.
Wow.
So suddenly, they realized 2 different killers.
2 different killers.
2 young girls linked by this horrible tragedy, but their cases no longer intertwined by the same perpetrator.
It's like realizing you've been piecing together the wrong puzzle this whole time.
Yeah.
All those years, operating under the wrong assumption. But this new revelation, it brought renewed hope. It brought a new chapter, in the investigation.
Right.
And that's where Detective Lindsay Wade comes in. A Tacoma native. She was actually a child herself when these murders happened.
She remembers the fear. She remembers how it changed the city. And those murders, along with reading Anne Rule's The Stranger Beside Me and talk about a book that really gets under your skin, it inspired her to become a detective.
It's a powerful book.
Yeah.
So she was determined to bring these killers to justice. She worked her way up, joined Tacoma's first cold case unit, and became fascinated by all the, the emerging possibilities of the DNA technology. Remember, this was still relatively new territory back then.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was.
And in 2015, she learned about a new technique, genealogical DNA profiling.
Right.
This technique allows investigators to use DNA databases to search for relatives of potential suspects. So it's kind of like casting a wider net, using family connections to, track down individuals who might otherwise remain hidden.
Exactly, yeah.
So they sent Jennifer's DNA sample off to a specialist. And get this specialist was a former rocket scientist turned genealogist. Talk about a career change.
Wow, that's something else.
So they got back 3 possible last names. One was Smith, way too common, not going to be helpful. But the other 2, Holbrook and Washburn, those were worth a shot.
Right.
And this is where Detective Wade's meticulous work, really shines. She pored over, thousands of pages of case files looking for any mention of those names.
Wow.
No Holbrooks, but there it was. Washburn. But not in Jennifer's files, though.
Oh.
It was in Michella's. Remember how Michella's case had that witness who described a man watching the girls?
Right, right.
Well, after the murder, BUT, before Jennifer disappeared, a man named Robert Washburn called in a tip saying he'd seen someone matching that description in it.
Right.
Wait for it. Point Defiance Park.
Yeah.
The very park where Jennifer was later abducted.
Chilling, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
like he was inserting himself into the investigation, almost like he was, taunting them. But back then, it probably just seemed like a concerned citizen trying to help.
Yeah. And they did interview him, but he had no prior record, nothing suspicious beyond that odd tip. But Lindsay, she kept digging. She added his name to her list, and then came the truly daunting task of creating a database from scratch. Remember, these were old files, not digitized.
Oh, yeah. We take that kind of technology for granted now. But back then, pen and paper, filing cabinets, just full of information.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So she spent months entering the names of every man who was mentioned in Jennifer's case. Over 2,300 of them. It's hard to imagine the dedication that took.
Persistence like that is incredible.
Yeah.
And it paid off, right? I mean, this database allowed her to start cross-referencing with DNA and incarceration records, narrowing the field of potential suspects.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then in 2018, she made a tough decision. Lindsay decided to retire from the police force.
Oh, wow.
And she took a job tackling the state's massive backlog of rape kits.
Yeah, that's a huge problem nationwide. All these untested kits, representing potential justice delayed or even denied.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she was thinking, maybe one of those kits held the key to another case. Maybe even Jennifer's. And get this, just a few weeks into her new job, she got the call. They had a match from Jennifer's swimsuit. And it was Robert Washburn, the man who called in that tip all those years earlier. If he hadn't inserted himself into the investigation, they might never have found him.
It's almost like he had this subconscious need to be acknowledged, right?
Yeah.
To be connected to the case. It's a phenomenon we sometimes see in criminal psychology.
It's fascinating and disturbing at the same time.
Mhm.
So they tracked Washburn down. He was in Illinois. And it turns out that he'd given a DNA sample willingly to investigators back in 2017.
Oh, wow.
So he was arrested for Jennifer's murder.
Yeah.
But remember, there was still Michella's case to solve. And remarkably, just a month later, another arrest.
Yeah, genealogical DNA had, narrowed it down to 2 brothers. They'd lived in Tacoma at the time of Michella's murder. And through some very clever police work, think discarded fast food napkins, they were able to get DNA samples.
Wow. And they had their match.
So Gary Hartman, 66 years old, a psychiatric nurse, it's always unsettling when, someone in a position of care is involved in such a horrific crime. It's a stark reminder that, monsters can hide in plain sight.
Yeah.
Even in seemingly, respectable professions.
Yeah, we have this tendency to categorize people.
Yeah.
To assume we can recognize evil just based on appearances or occupation. But these cases they're a chilling reminder that the truth is often much more complex.
Both men, they tried to deflect responsibility. They claimed they were deep into addiction when they committed these acts. But of course, for the families, the damage was already done. No excuse could erase the pain and the loss they'd endured for all those years. Yeah. Jennifer's father sadly passed away years earlier. Never got to see justice for his daughter. But Jennifer's mother, Patty, and remember, she and Lindsay had become close over the years. She was there in the courtroom for Washburn's sentencing. And she addressed him directly. She asked him, "Do you know how many birthdays we missed? Do you know how many Christmases we missed?"
It's a question that just, that hangs heavy in the air, doesn't it? All those stolen moments, all those milestones missed, a lifetime of what ifs and could have beens. Washburn, he barely reacted, showed no emotion. Hardman, on the other hand, he actually went to trial. He claimed he didn't even remember the crime.
But prosecutors revealed that he had actually told a coworker years earlier that he'd done something terrible 30 years ago and that he feared being caught. So much for, memory loss. The jury saw through his claims and ultimately found him guilty.
Both men received the same sentence, 26 years and 6 months. It's hard to say whether any sentence can truly provide a sense of justice for such horrific crimes. But for the families, it was at least some measure of closure, some recognition of the immense pain and loss that they had endured.
And the families, they didn't stop there. They channeled their grief into action, worked to ensure that other families might not have to endure those decades of unanswered questions. Jennifer's mother, Patty, her sister, Teresa, and Detective Wade, they all worked together to create something positive from this tragedy.
They championed Jennifer and Michella's law, which was passed in Washington State in 2019. This law allows for the collection of DNA from deceased sex offenders, something that would have been immensely helpful in these cases. It also requires DNA samples from people who were convicted of indecent exposure, expanding the database and potentially preventing future crimes.
It's a powerful example of how, even in the face of just unimaginable tragedy, individuals can find the strength to create positive change. These cases, as heartbreaking as they are, also highlight the incredible advancements in DNA technology and the impact it's having on solving cold cases, bringing closure to families and holding perpetrators accountable.
It's a reminder that justice, even when delayed, is still possible. And that hope, though sometimes fragile, can endure even the darkest of times.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive, into a story that, while difficult, offers a glimpse into the resilience of the human spirit and the power of perseverance.
And a reminder that even though there will always be those who seek to harm, there will also be those who, dedicate their lives to seeking justice and fighting for the vulnerable.
We'll be back soon with more, fascinating stories and thought-provoking discussions. Until then, stay curious and stay safe.